So welcome everyone. This is the meeting or the Emergent session on data privacy and research data sharing, or specifically neuroimage research data sharing. And we had a session last week with, I think, something like 10 or 11 people discussing that at a broad level, and which ideas are out there that we can use to facilitate both taking care of the privacy of individuals, but also being able to share research data. So that was great, and we basically suggested a follow-up on something more specific, and we discussed a few options, and this was the topic that came out of that. Even though that doesn't mean all of the other topics are of less priority, this one was just seemed like it had a bit more interest from a bit more people. And this one is called anonymization. And we have the Etherpad notes that are linked in the chat here. And we have the Mattermost channel that exists from the previous time. Cass, could you perhaps post that? And then we have the GitHub issue as well that people can comment on. So the idea is that we use most of the time to discuss anonymization and what that means. And in the Etherpad notes, we have a few questions like, what does anonymization mean? How does it differ from pseudonymization or personal data? Is that a spectrum of definitions, or do you have to follow different lines of definition to get to each of those ones? And at which point can you actually feel that the risk is low enough to share whatever the definition is of the data at that point? So we got a few people on screen that I would like them to introduce themselves. But firstly, I'm Stephan, and my involvement in this thing is basically I started joining a project at last year's OHBM hackathon on this issue, like, can we develop some templates that help people, or specifically researchers along the way, to be able to design a study with informed consent and the right consent forms and the right wording for GDPR specific compliance, such that they can reuse these templates and make their lives a bit easier to be able to share data, but also then take care of the privacy of individuals. So I've been involved in that sense, and I'll ask Pierre to introduce himself quickly.
Yeah. Thanks, Stephan, for organizing this and having me part here again. So I'm a postdoc at the Montreal Neurological Institute, and I got involved in all of this as Stephan, basically, because we were both wondering how to adapt this thing called the Open Brain Consent Form for GDPR, and both of us did some stuff prior to that, and then decided to combine our efforts, and then a lot of other people got in as well, which is great. Robert is one of them as well. And I also started working on a BITS app called Nilsonne that does de-identification, or let's say de-identification for BITS data sets.
Shall I go next? So I'm Robert Oostenveld. I'm an associate PI at the Donders Institute, part of Radboud University in Nijmegen. I'm mainly working on the MEG and EEG methods, which I'm sharing as open source tools. But I think already around 10 years ago, I got involved in the Human Connectome project, where we had a very ambitious plan of sharing the data of a large number of participants. And of course, that's a data set that you all know. And in the preparatory phase of the Human Connectome project, we had a lot of discussions on how we could share this data. It was not only imaging data, but it was also genetics, also the family structure. And from those discussions, I got a lot of insights on how to think about these types of challenges that we're facing, which I was later able to use when we at the Donders Institute started setting up our Donders research data repository, which we now have operational for, I think, 4 years or so. I think we have about 100 published neuroimaging data sets on the repository. We also have a lot of non-shared data on the repositories. We're also using it for private archiving. Yeah, so that's more or less what my background is in like dealing with identifiable data. And just to perhaps to mention, so I'm working at the Donors Institute, and we're scanning, like in normal times, not now, but although we're just starting, we're scanning about 4,000 volunteers every year. So we have about 4,000 research participants every year on the 3 MRI scanners, the MRG system, and a few EEG labs that we have. So we also really care about all of these volunteers that are coming to the donors to participate, to help with our research.
Thanks, Robert. Melanie.
Yeah, hi. I'm Melanie. I'm an assistant professor at the Department of Computer Science at the University of Copenhagen, and then I also work half-time at the National Hospital in Denmark, where I work in the neurobiology research unit. My focus is on PET imaging, and I'm part of one of the biggest PET labs in Europe, where we focus on the serotonin system. And I'll just post it in chat, but we have since 2005 established a large database of PET imaging and MR imaging and fMRI imaging data. And we are now in the process of seeing how to make this data more available. Currently, the SIMBI database is available upon request, so you can come in, make a project description, then make a data agreement with us, and we can share. And this has worked quite well, and the database has been well utilized until now, both internally and also by people all around the world. But especially after GDPR has taken effect, this has basically barred us from sharing it with anyone outside of Europe. So right now we have a very hard time to get anything shared beyond the European borders. And while, for example, during last week's discussion, I've been in touch with Jarek regarding this GDPR compliant consent form. For example, we sent it to our database administrator, that's the current state, and his answer was that, well, in Denmark, unless we have fully anonymized data, we are not allowed to share it at all unless it's to a very specific purpose, and we have a data agreement that states exactly who has access to it, which makes data sharing very, very hard. And because we sit on this large resource of PET data, we really are grasping for anything that can help us make this more accessible, because it's just a waste if we don't free this up for people.
Thanks. I think at the risk of misrepresenting slightly her views, there was a very similar point made by Liu Bartel, who's working with the Human Brain Project on their data in terms of not being able to share. And she was unable to join us for the discussion, but will probably be part of continued conversations. And there are also a number of other people, including Gustav Nilsonne, who will also likely join us on screen later, and some others that I might forget. So quickly, I will just kick one of you off and then show a slide just as background information about the definitions, not the definitions, possible definitions of anonymous, personal, and pseudonymous data. And then I'll ask Pierre to just quickly run through for the audience what typically would happen if you go from like raw DICOMs for MRI, for example, to something that we can consider to be de-identified to a certain extent. And then we can jump into the nice and interesting parts. So I'm going to kick off, Robert, if that's fine for you, and then just bring up the screen. So you will have to tell me if you can see what's happening. So I'm selecting that and I'm shifting my screen. Can anyone? I cannot see this. Can someone tell me if you can see it? Okay, so you can see the slide.
Yep.
Okay. So I'm reusing a slide from Doreen Heiser, and she also had a talk in the Open Science Room earlier last week about practical ways to go about this problem of anonymizing and deciding what to share and what you can't. But essentially, the idea here is, and it's very top level, is that anonymized data is data that you cannot trace to an individual. So you cannot re-identify. You have a single data set like a T1 weighted MRI, and you look at the name, you look at the metadata, and you look at the the actual facial features, but you cannot use anything of that because it's been de-identified and you cannot identify the person from that information. And according to the GDPR, if you can define data as being anonymous, then you can share it without restrictions. Then it is not personal data, and you don't have to comply with everything that GDPR suggests, or not suggests, expects. When we get to, so that is an easy definition, but obviously it's difficult to get to a point where you can confidently say this is anonymous. So all other data from a human being is considered personal. It's basically looking at data that's directly traceable or indirectly traceable. So if you can directly see from a picture that is the person I know, then that data is identifiable. If you cannot see that directly, but you could perhaps trace it using other information, then that is still considered personal data. And the examples that Doreen gave here is like, if you're looking for all the people that's over 100 years old living in a certain neighborhood, that data is directly traceable. If you have data that has been anonymized for an individual, but you can link it to a different database somehow, legally or illegally, then that is still considered personal data. So the point is that it might be pseudonymous, so you might not see it directly from a first look that this is that person's data, but if you can use other information to get to that point, so you can re-identify, that is still considered personal data. And you need a legal basis on which to process that data. And according to my understanding, sharing is also considered to be a form of processing, and that's why we need to take into account the GDPR when you want to share as well. So now I'm getting back to close this message, stop sharing my screen, and I'm pulling up Robert again. And perhaps, Pierre, you can now continue with just a quick overview of what we mean with de-identification.
Yeah, sure. So as Stephan already pointed out, that whole anonymization versus pseudonymization is a very important topic, especially for GDPR, because it's one of the terms and things we have to define very precisely and talk about very precisely in order to be compliant with GDPR. And based on that, so what people usually do, and when it comes to de-identification of neuroimaging data sets, there are a bunch of things you need to tackle. First and foremost, the most obvious thing is the data itself. And there, especially structural data, anatomical data, let it be T1 weighted imaging, T2 weighted imaging. I'm pretty sure most of you have seen these kind of creepy looking things where you can do a 3D reconstruction from a T1 image or a T2 image. I mean, it's always not looking super like flattering for anyone, but it's possible to identify people by just looking at a reconstructed thing, right? And because it has facial features. Just for example, for me, even though you don't see a lot of my face, it's there somewhere. And if you do a T1 with an image of me, you can also see that. And based on that, a lot of people did a lot of interesting packages, software for so-called defacing, where if you think about, if you have to look at sagittal slice, what they do is just cut out a certain part of it, right? So you have to remove features that are very informative in terms of facial recognition. That is the eyes, nose, chin, like all that, right? So these algorithms do a different sort of cut when it comes to remove these features. So that's one part, defacing. It's either like cutting out a certain part, like cutting it out of the whole, cutting something in. It's just, we have on the Open Brain Consent Form website, we have some examples for different software. And the other thing, if you think about BITS dataset, as you might and hopefully are aware, they have a lot of metadata, which is obviously great and such a huge add-on and important thing to have coming from non-BITS era stuff, right? The problem is that depending on what people do and what they put in their sequences at the scanner and what they have in the headers and whatnot, and if you convert it to a BITS dataset, there's a fair chance that in your metadata, you have a lot of information that can help re-identify people, right? It can be where, when the scan was recorded, and so forth. So if you want to be as precise as possible when it comes to the identification, you should also have a look at your metadata and what's in there, and if this information is potentially problematic when it comes to, for example, GDPR terms.
I think Robert has some slides that we can use as a background also to... You're muted, Robert. We can see your slides, we just cannot hear you. And we can see you as well, so... I think you have to go back to crowd, maybe stop sharing and then go back to Crowdcast, hover over yourself, and then unmute and then share slides again.
Yeah, I think that's indeed the procedure. I'll share it like this, and then I have to reopen my slides. You can hear me, right?
Yes, and the slides are...
Good.
It's a gray screen at the moment, but it should appear.
Yeah, slides are coming.
Yeah.
Yeah, already coming. Yep.
So what I had like planning for this meeting, I thought let's just try to get some definitions clear. The way that I'm always thinking about personal data and also discussing it in Nijmegen is that personal data is, on one hand, it's the information that the police will look for on a crime scene. So if you find a corpse or like a dead body, they're going to tap all the pockets to see whether there's a passport or something with a name, an address, a date of birth on it, etc. And if they cannot find it, then CSI is called in, and then it gets more complex because biometrical data is also personal. So what they're then going to do is they're going to look at like facial details, your dental record, fingerprints, and all of that type of stuff, which can be used to potentially identify a person if these biometrical features are unique and sufficiently stable over time. But then it is important to realize that these biometrical features, they require a match to an external database. Whereas for a passport, your name is directly written in it. Think about why is this always a confusing factor? So I just looked up the word in a dictionary. So I looked up anonymous. So it's of unknown authorship or origin, or not named or identified, or lacking individuality, distinction, or recognizability. Whereas a pseudonym is a fictitious name. And identify is to determine, is to establish the identity of someone. But then for me, there's two different dimensions in these types of discussions, and that's again when I was thinking, like, if we place this outside of neuroscience, but rather like something that we see a lot in the news nowadays. So like all these protests on the street. So if you imagine you go on a protest on the street, what would you do? Would you bring your ID with you, or would you bring your fake ID, or would you not bring an ID? Like, imagine what would happen if you would be caught by the police, or by like not necessarily police that you want to be caught by. But of course, there's also the other dimension. Like, would you expose your face in plain sight, or would you wear a mask to hide your face? So these are just like two different domains. The one has to do with papers, and the other one has to do with biometrical information. So this would result in a 2x3 matrix of options, and it's not necessarily relevant to go over all these different options, but it's important that there's two dimensions in it. And if we, again, going back to neuroimaging, if we organize personal data, then we're already very much used to organizing personal data such that we can delete it. So we do not record the name of the participants together with the data. We do not record details such as the address, although we do need those things for the reimbursement of our participants, for contacting them, etc. But we organize them for deletion. But of course, we still have the pseudonyms, which are like symbolic names that we're giving to our participants, and we have some information such as the age and the gender. But we also have the personal data of the scans. And this is where I think that there's like the two different domains come in. On the one hand, it's anonymous and pseudonymization, and that has to do with the participant's identity as it's written down in a document, as a passport. Whereas the way that I always think about de-identification, it's about doing something with the research data to remove the indirectly identifying features. Such that could be like defacing the anatomical MRI, but also giving the age at acquisition rather than the date of birth, etc. And yesterday when I went back to the definition, and I realized why there's often this confusion about these different terms, because anonymous is both not named or not identified. But anonymous is also being used to indicate lacking individuality, distinction, or recognizability. And actually an interesting thing that I saw here, like the anonymous faces in the crowd. Well, so it's interesting to think about these faces in the crowd as being anonymous, but unless you're wearing a mask, you might not be anonymous anymore with all these facial recognition software and cameras that are being pointed on demonstrating crowds. So I think that part of the confusion that we often see also in discussing this with security officers, etc., and with ethical boards stems from the double meaning that anonymous has. And I think not named, or the double meaning that people can give to it. And I think if we recognize that there's personal data both at the level of identifiers, but also at the level of biometric data, and that the identifiers, even if we remove the identifiers, that we still have identifiable data, so stressing the 2 dimensions, I think it's going to, I hope it is going to become more clear in the discussions with all the stakeholders, including our research participants, who are a very important stakeholder in this, but also the ethics board, security officers, etc., in how to deal with this. So I think this is like for me the best example that I could come up with is like, what can you do to hide your identity, to stay private, with the 2 different aspects.
Could we call Melanie back up?
Yeah.
If you can close your. There's also been quite a number of comments in the chat now about anonymization algorithms. Hi, Melanie. Could you had a question also for Robert?
I wanted to bring up much here and Robert for clarifying this, and I think I would like this also discussed, especially because we work so much across the Atlantic. But I think the terms of anonymization, what anonymization itself means, are also handled differently in the US. At least we have seen this now with our PET collaborators in the US and here in Europe. So as Per introduced, that means that GDPR allows us to share fully anonymized data. And what Robert has introduced now is that this means taking all the de-identifier or re-identifier information away from the header, but also from the image and so on. But what this also means in terms of GDPR is, at least in the Danish interpretation, that even if you have then a subject ID to a certain subject, it's not enough for sharing that we remove this from the data set that we send up to OpenNeuro. We have to actually throw the key so that we internally can re-identify who was this person. We have to throw this away. And this is different in the United States. So we call it pseudo-anonymized if the lab that owns or acquired the data can keep the keys, whereas in Europe we consider it only fully anonymized if we throw our keys away. And that's problematic because a lot of our labs, we have ongoing research projects, or we have big databases where we call people back to tell people they should throw away the keys that allows them to recontact people from the last 15 years. That's something that will not be, I don't think you can convince people to do that. And that, I think, is a very, exactly, Gustav says it's the same in Belgium. So this is a distinct difference between the United States and Europe in this context. And I think I would really like to have this discussed and addressed by the others. Exactly, you cannot also update the database afterwards.
A quick comment on that. There's also variability in different jurisdictions, even within the same countries, and we can see that. The paper that's recently out on bioRxiv from Lucas Snoek et al. About the AOMIC Amsterdam dataset. But I would really be interested to see. It's about 1,000 or more participants, and their data is on OpenNeuro. And I would really be interested to see like what exactly the documentation has been that's been involved in it. If the key is deleted, for example, and where their definition of anonymous lies.
But one of the things, if I can break in here, one of the things that I'm often worrying about is that we're stressing too much the opportunities that pseudonymization offers. I think by using pseudonyms, we're not really solving much. We're solving a little bit. But data that is released under a pseudonym can still be identified. Like a book that is written by an author who writes it under a pseudonym can still be identified. So the same goes for the data. And I think if we want to protect the identity of our participants, then pseudonyms or anonymous data, we have to think like, is there a possibility of re-identifying, and how would that possibility work? And with pseudonyms, as Melanie is saying, like if the lab where the data was acquired, if that lab maintains a key file, mapping the key onto the original data, then that is a mechanism, but that's a mechanism that can be very well protected. Whereas the mechanisms of re-identification by mapping cortical fingerprints to publicly available data, or reconstructed faces to publicly available data, I think those are, as a participant, I would be much more worried about those, because those do not fall under the control of the original lab.
Yeah, that's exactly the point, though. Like, and as Daniel shared a lot of interesting links in the comments, including like a new refacing tool in AFNI, which looks very interesting. Sorry, I did not see that before. That apparently like reconstruct a face, but it's not identifiable, right? It's like a template face thing. But that's only one thing, right? If you do defacing, sure, those things are missing. But for example, depending on the algorithm, you should not, or maybe should not, like remove, for example, the ears, because as Robert might back up here, right? If you do EEG, imaging stuff, the ears are important for like some new registration purposes. So you could forbid certain analysis if that's what you would like to have there in there. And the other thing is you don't need the face to re-identify a person, because as Robert outlined very nicely, there's so much that can help people or whoever wants to re-identify someone to reconstruct an identity. That's not only the face, it's like all there that's in there, right? We've seen in other publications, maybe someone can share it in the chat, or otherwise I look it up, where people used, I think it was EEG, and it was like a resting state based approach where this is the fingerprinting, and people are identified based on that. And the thing is, if people are part of multiple studies and always agree to data sharing, and those studies have different acquisition methods, whatever, at some point in time that's not far in the future, I think it will be possible to connect across databases to. And then that's becoming a problem. Not talking full metrics here, whatever, but that's the reality, folks, right?
And maybe I'd just like to comment on this. Something that we have discussed extensively with our data lawyers here has been that they say, let's say you have tried your best to de-identify the data set. It should be very, very hard to identify, or it should be with reasonable amount of work that you need to do to re-identify. So I think also, if only the most advanced researchers in the world can do the fingerprinting and re-identify, then from the legal perspective, they're fine with it. But I still think algorithms are getting better and better and better. So what we consider to be hard nowadays is not going to be hard 2-3 years from now.
Yeah.
So in that sense, I also think it's a mechanism we need to be aware of.
Yeah. So let me also comment on this. Like, imagine a graduate student who did his education in a neuroimaging lab and then moves on to another lab and moves on to another lab. And at every lab he participates in studies. So that brain would end up in multiple databases, and that brain would also every time would be defaced. But if you just match those brains together, and if you look them up on Facebook where he has been posting, I have this new position. Or if you just map this with GPS coordinates, then all of a sudden such a brain is identifiable. And so that is also something that we identified in the Human Connectome project and have used within for designing the data use agreements that we rely on in the donors repository, is that it's the mapping data to external databases. That is where that's the mechanism by which you identify on the basis of biometrical information. So within the donors data use agreement, we have an explicit statement that legally prohibits mapping the data that we're sharing with external databases. So it's not we're also using technical means such as defacing, but on top of that, we're using legal means. So as such, the data is not openly, it cannot be used for anything, because there's certain things that you cannot do with it, and explicitly you cannot use the data to identify.
I would like to ask Gustav also to comment on this also the concept of relative anonymity. But perhaps just for a few seconds before, Gustav, can you just introduce yourself?
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Thanks for having me on. I'm Gustav Nilsonne. I'm a researcher at the Karolinska Institute and also affiliated with the Swedish National Data Service.
Thanks.
So, yeah. So, I have also had many conversations with data lawyers about pseudonymization, where they advance the idea that if there exists a code key, then data are not fully anonymous. And I think the reason for this is that the GDPR says very explicitly that pseudonymization in itself does not make data anonymous. And that's very logical. If I have the information, then it doesn't matter if it's in two different files. I still have the information. However, I think it's important to note that that applies to the person that holds the code key. If I am a third party I don't have access to the code key, then we have to ask if there exists a reasonably likely means by which I could acquire the code key and perform a re-identification. For instance, I have many times reanalyzed data from old papers where I have reconstructed individual level data from scatter plots. And in the bivariate distribution, there are unique values such that each participant can be singled out by the combination of the two variables in the plot. But it's not possible for me to identify anyone because I don't have any reasonably likely means to access the key. If a key indeed exists, in most cases, it's not possible to know if one exists or not. And so the key concept here is that anonymity is relative depending on what information I can access during my processing of the data. I also believe that there is a very sound legal basis for this, and I can post some links. The principle has been tried in the European Court of Justice, and I won't go into that. But I do believe strongly that if we protect our code keys, we can share pseudonymized data, and for a third party, they will then be able to treat it as anonymized, provided that that identifiers have been successfully removed and there are not other indirect ways to re-identify a person.
Anyone want to comment on that? Melanie?
Yeah, maybe I have a question for Gustav. I think this is great to know since we're exactly in the same position in Denmark. And the only question for me is then still, we still need to remove everything from the data that could be easy re-identifiable. So we still would want to remove scanned date, for example, age. For example, I work in a national hospital. If you know the queen has come in for treatment, same in Sweden, right? It doesn't matter how many MR scans they were made that day. You will figure out who the queen is if you can get access to scans, no matter who it is, and even if the face would be removed, it would be relatively easy to figure out which scan it was. So we still need to do all the other work besides what you're proposing. Isn't that correct?
Yes, absolutely. I agree with that. And I have redacted things like age and height and weight from my own data sets that I've published.
Robert, do you maybe want to comment on this, but with specific regards to what you're doing at the donors repository?
So as I already mentioned, at the donors repository, a very important characteristic is a legal characteristics that we're saying we cannot, if you agree to using this data, you have to abide to not linking the data to other databases. That often leads to internal discussions. Sometimes researchers want to share data, for example, in multiple tranches, or like longitudinal data, where the first data set is released after year 1, and then the second data set is released after year 5. And of course, then at that moment, you do want to link those two data sets together. But I think that the technical linking versus the legal linking, I think those are two important characteristics that we should make researchers more aware of. And we should not confuse that like the technical means that we implement, such as blurring data or redacting data to remove explicit variability, for example, in age or weight or those parameters, and making those more coarse. So those are all technical methods to make it more difficult to link the data. But we also have to operate within a legal framework. And within the legal framework, in the long run, technical solutions are not going to be sufficient. We also have to make a legal framework. And I think that's where data use agreements are really important in. And I think that that is also something that we should be able to explain to our research participants, like under which conditions are we sharing our data. And we should be more aware of and also like aware of ourselves. If we would be participants, like what could other people do with our data? And I clearly see this eagerness of people that want to access data. There's also eagerness of people that want to share data. Like especially young researchers are very much into open science, which I think is extremely valuable. But I think coming up with explicit examples, such as like what happens if the Queen is in your MR scanner, or what happens if your mum is in an MR scanner, which I would consider a more important person. I think those cases, like how would I as a researcher protect the identity of someone that I care about? I think it's those types of use cases might help us to sharpen our own thinking about this.
When you say we should also work on the legal framework and use the data use agreement as an example of that, that would be another mechanism of lowering the risk of re-identification, given that we might still define it as personal data or pseudonymous data. And my question is, like, what are the legal ramifications if people do not abide by the data use agreement, for example, in the donors repository? Because I don't see, like, I've personally gotten feedback that yes, it's a good point. It's like a block or a mini gate that you put in front of someone to make them like a bit shy of just jumping into it. But is it legally binding, or is it set up? Does it need to change to be more legally binding in some way that there could actually be ramifications? And I'm thinking of a situation like if the legal basis is consent, and you still have the linking key, and it's still defined as pseudonymous, and you use the data use agreement to share that data, someone else gains access to the data. If the person comes back, the data participant comes back and say, I want people not to use that anymore, I guess we're expected to then ask the people who gained access to the data through the data use agreement to not use it anymore. But what can you do about that more than just asking them? and with respect to like legal ramifications of that?
So it's one of the things that it's a very good question. It's something that we've discussed. We have the data use agreement in place. We have the requirement in place that for data sets containing potentially identifiable data, that people that want to download the data, they have to, so the researchers that want to download the data, they have to identify themselves such that they can be contacted in case there is, that the data would be abused in one way or another. But it's also clear that the university doesn't really know how that would work. Like the legal department of the university is very small. They would not be looking forward to dragging someone in front of the court if someone were to not abide to the data use agreement. I think it's in that respect we should also also see the legal department of the universities as our allies that should help us in doing this type of things, because in the future they will have to do the work in cleaning up the mess that they are currently creating. Because at this moment we are not always as precisely abiding to the legal frameworks, and even if we do, then we still rely on them. So I think like more appreciation of the different roles of the different stakeholders here, so the legal departments, the data security officer, the ethical officers. I think that would help, I think we would, like as researchers, we have to take multiple viewpoints, like the viewpoint of sharing data from someone that you love, that you care about, but also the viewpoint of like being in an ethical board. Like how would you act then, rather than as a researcher saying, "Oh, these ethical boards are only annoying."
I completely agree with Robert. I think for us, it has only helped to be in closer collaboration with the data lawyers and to also explain what is possible and what is not possible. For them, sometimes if they don't understand the process, they will always go the most careful way. I've had the issue that I'm not allowed to show a single slice in a JPEG of a brain, and I'm like, what do you think I'm showing in a publication? What ends then happening, for example, is I need to take a picture of my own brain and take a PDF out of my own brain, because that then I know nobody comes after me because it's me putting it out there. But I think the communication with the legal departments are so important, because they are the one that should be our allies in making this work, and not always the, oh my God, they complain about another thing.
Yeah, I think this point of working more closely together with people in different domains can lead nicely into what we also want to discuss with regards to the community aspect of this session. But perhaps I can maybe get some final comments from anyone on screen or off screen, if anyone wants to make a specific point with regards to anonymization in particular. On screen looks like no. Anyone in the chat? Yeah, so just as a reminder, we have the Etherpad notes that's linked below our faces here, and also we have the chat in Mattermost that we can continue a very interesting discussion of anonymization. So I'd like to ask also from the audience what you think, if there is interest in making this a bit more of a community effort. So we have we actually built up quite a nice community effort over some time the past year. And I think, and sorry, before that as well. So I'm a bit blind to what happened before that. So there's some bias from my side there. So I would like to gauge some interest and hear some thoughts about how you think we can shape this into something that perhaps we meet virtually on a less irregular basis, and we work a bit more towards like some consensus on some points and give suggestions to researchers, etc. So any comments from people on the screen on that? or what would practically how that could practically look like. Nope. Okay. Well, so the point is that perhaps I should put up a poll, a working group. Yaroslav says we could establish a working group. So with the open brain consent working group, we were working on a bit of a paper to at least describe what is happening in open brain consent. But yeah, I agree with Yaroslav. There should be a clearer goal. So what does anyone here think we should achieve by working together?
I think if we could have a working group that does exactly what we did today and makes a resource for communication with the data protection offices, that makes a translation between the researchers and the lawyers, that, you know, where we take these kind of resources, what does anonymization, pseudonymization, etc. mean? So we can share it with both sides and also make a list. We have had so many nice publications put up here of what is possible in terms of de-identification. What are algorithms to identify? If we could make a working group that works on making a kind of wiki, look up, this is possible, this is state of the art right now, that would be a very useful resource for working with our individual offices that are unfortunately all country specific.
Yeah, I think so. There's probably some resources already captured in open brain consent, but I think that could probably improve also, because there is more focusing on the templates and different translations of those templates, and also some information on with templates I mean the consent form and the data use agreement. But also there's also some information on like the different tools people can use for anonymization. But perhaps we can also identify a few other things that we need more resources for. Keep track of what's okay and what's not okay per country. I think that's a good goal, but probably a bit difficult. Sorry, Robert.
I think it would be interesting to think about like what are the different stakeholders, because I think it's between the different stakeholders that's where the friction starts happening. And I realized that with the open brain consent, this is very much about the consent form that we as researchers are sharing with our research participants. We're of course two stakeholders in this, and perhaps we should just like think about like how can we form work groups to work with the different stakeholders. The technical de-identification efforts that might, for example, be seen as to remove friction between one group of researchers, the data producers, and another group of researchers, the data consumers. Like how can we de-identify data without losing too much information? But also like security officers, how do we get them involved? Or ethical boards, how do we get them involved? The legal department, how do we get them involved?
I guess each individual here who's been working on things like this a lot has a link to their own department. Their own legal department or data protection office, or at least hopefully one person that they can get somewhat useful information from, and maybe that's a good start.
Yeah, but the legal department of the University in Nijmegen is actually surprisingly small. Luckily, I think it shows that we don't have too many legal issues that we need a large legal department. But it also means that they are overworked in the same way as we researchers tend to be overworked. So they don't have the time to sit in lengthy project meetings in the same way as we don't have the time to sit with them. So actually explaining to a concrete a concrete result that we could work towards is a document or a website that explains the legal consequence of data sharing, such that a lawyer can read it and can understand the peculiarities of our data. Where we would say, well, these are the things that we're not worried about, that we as researchers are not worried about, and these are the things that we are as researchers are worried about. So if you're going to look at this from a legal perspective, then please have a look at this, rather than for the lawyer to have to figure out everything again.
Well, I like that as a concrete output, because we've been working towards something like this, but we haven't explicitly said what it is. I'm just looking at some comments. Cass says they're starting a data privacy impact assessment at Oxford for a new sharing platform, and she'd love to share what they learned there and the work that goes into it. Yeah, I think the goal of making something generic is good, and probably requires a bit more work than something very specific to like only fMRI data, for example. But yes, I'm also interested in setting up use cases to set some sort of precedent, because that makes it always easier to follow a discussion and agree on things. So if we can refer to, I'm currently trying to do that with my very small volunteer study, is using the open brain consent documentation, agreeing with a version of that, agreeing on a version of that with my data protection office, and then getting the actual consent and then pushing the data through and then making it work. And I think that a really nice precedent already is with the Donors Institute or Donors Repository. But if we can like set up different use cases that tend to agree on at least some points on the implementation, that could be a nice use case study, or at least some examples to share with as more concrete outputs.
Yeah, I think it's so we care a lot about sharing research data, but I think we should also value the sharing of the procedural information, and that's what I really liked about the Open Brain Consent project. Is like in trying to figure out like which consent forms are currently publicly available, which ones can we share, and comparing them, and then actually in the comparison you learn a lot on how other imaging centers are doing things. I would not say that the Donors is necessarily the best example, but we have quite some information in the open, so that makes an easy example to look at. And in the same way as the Human Connectome project had all of this information in the open. And I think we should find other ways as well of sharing more of these legal documents or these privacy impact assessment documents, and also get them shared such that we can have not only researchers looking at open data, open brain data, but that we can also have lawyers look at open legal data.
I think Jarek's comment there is that is also why the open brain consent came into existence, to share that procedural data. I would love to have like a database of projects that can say we used open brain consent, or at least some locally checked version of that.
But I would also love to have a database of ethics approvals, where the consent is only part of ethics approval.
Yeah.
Or like a database.
Are they not public? For us, they're public. They are public to you.
For clinical studies, are they public in the?
I need to double check, but I think for clinical studies.
In the Netherlands, only a very short summary is public, which means that actually all the interesting details that where you could learn something from are not public. Or data management plans, which is one of these things that we're now all required to write data management plans, but there's very few data management plans that you can learn from.
Yeah.
I wish we had more of those public as well.
All of the things. I think we're rounding up a bit. So there's a comment by Doreen that says DMP online allows public data management plans, or perhaps it does. Yeah, I don't know the platform, but thanks for the comment. I think probably we should start finishing. So I first would like to say thank you for everyone on screen for the discussion and sharing your point of view. Anyone around here can contribute more. I think we will probably take some time and maybe set up a next meeting in somewhere in the indefinite future. where we can discuss whatever we wrote down on the Etherpad notes and bring some learnings together and maybe set a few concrete goals. As Gus said, please vote in the poll. Yes, please. And then, what was another comment? I have forgotten. There's a few, yeah, maybe if you want to check back on the conversation that led to this, there was another crowdcast from last week that we discussed not only anonymization, but like broader spectrum solutions. And there was the thing discussed about privacy preserving tech, which seems like it could be interesting for this, like in future. And that's all for now. Thank you for joining. Thanks, Melanie,
Okay.
Pierre, Robert,
Thanks for
and
having
Gustav.
us.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Cheers, everyone.
Thanks very much.